Marvel's Spider-Man 2 has been out for a while now. The series as a whole has showcased a number of different characters, villains, storylines, and references. So it's natural to wonder where things could go from the end of Spider-Man 2. I want to take a look at some of those loose ends and undeveloped references that are still around in the series as a whole. These are things that could be picked up as a main story, DLC, spin-offs, or side content in the next sequel. They could also be ends that are just never picked up again. Regardless, I wanted to go through the series and highlight the ones that I found. A word of warning before we start though. This list will be heavy on spoilers from every game in the series up to this point. So if you haven't played the Marvel's Spider-Man series, then I would recommend doing that before checking out this list. While I don't want to discourage people from watching one of my videos, I also don't want to spoil story elements of the series for people either. With that said, let's get on to the list of possible things we could see in the future, at least based on what we've already seen in this series so far. First on my list is Kingpin. Kingpin was the opening battle in the first game and still held a presence throughout the events of that entry, even though he was in prison. Spider-Man Miles Morales showed Kingpin trying to re-establish power in Harlem, but was thwarted by Miles and his friends. Kingpin was suspiciously absent in Spider-Man 2 though. I would never count the Kingpin of crime out of a comeback. He now has a grudge against both Spider-Man, and the symbiote crisis could open up enough of a chance for Kingpin to start amassing power once again. Personally, I would really like to see Kingpin as a focus of a DLC for Spider-Man 2, kind of like the original Spider-Man's DLC went for a more mob, criminal underworld direction than a big villain battle. It would be Miles and Peter stopping Kingpin from rising to power once again. Could even be interesting to see them fail at this while still thwarting his scheme in some capacity. Another entry from the first game is Taskmaster. This mercenary appeared in the first Spider-Man, but has been silent ever since. While I wasn't a huge fan of his challenges, you did get the idea that Taskmaster was interested in Spider-Man and that you would have to deal with him again in the future. Interestingly, you also see him on Kraven's map in Spider-Man 2 as a potential target for Kraven's hunt. However, Taskmaster never shows up after that first game. Having Taskmaster come as a focus of a DLC or as a different type of side content in a future game could be interesting to see. Connected to Taskmaster, we still don't know who hired Taskmaster in the first game. It's a mystery that we just really haven't had any clues about since then, or at least none that I've found. And really, I have no good ideas as to who could be behind this. We just don't really know enough about the larger organizations in this Marvel universe, but I would love this thread to be picked up and revisited in the future. Speaking of larger organizations in the Marvel Universe, there was the reference to AIM in the first game as well. Dr. Octavius winds up getting funding and equipment from AIM after Norman Osborn pulls the grant from the city that was funding Octavius's research. We aren't really told much about them, but we can see boxes with the AIM logo on them in Otto's lab. It would be interesting to engage with some of these bigger organizations like we did with Roxxon and Miles Morales in future Spider-Man adventures. Whether that will happen or not, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Another look back to the original game is Screwball. Now, I understand that Screwball's kind of a controversial villain in the series, and she's not a super serious villain, and she's definitely not my top choice of people to see again, but I didn't also mind having a little bit of a sillier villain that was still a threat. Maybe not much of one to Spider-Man, but to the city and those caught in her narcissistic social media schemes. Even just hearing that she's still in prison or that Kraven got her in Spider-Man 2 would be enough for me here. Also from the original game is Morgan Michaels. When I hear names that I don't necessarily recognize but play a big part in a story, I tend to look them up. I did this with Morgan Michaels and realized that it was an alias that was associated with Morbius the Living Vampire. This could be a setup to have Morbius as a villain, hero, or some kind of anti-hero vigilante in the future. Admittedly, Dr. Michaels hasn't been in the story since that first game, but there's nothing saying that he can't make a reappearance in a future game or DLC. Having a vampire in the mix and going a little bit more down the supernatural route could be an interesting direction for the Spider-Man series. Next is the question, is Rhino still alive? The last we saw our lover of wild goose chases, he was getting stabbed by Finn, aka the Tinkerer, in Spider-Man Miles Morales. He was one of the few major villains that we didn't see or hear about in Spider-Man 2. I did see that there was originally a plan to have a trophy room for Kraven that included Rhino's head, but since that was cut from the game, the fate of Rhino is still up in the air. I hope that we haven't seen the last of Rhino and he gets to pop up again in a future story. Next is Black Cat. Now here is one that isn't quite as big of a loose end. She's in the first game as well as the DLC for that game, and is also in Spider-Man 2, where she steals the Wand of Watum from Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum to create a portal to Paris to get to her girlfriend. Now in some ways this seems like a great exit for Black Cat from New York and both Spider-Man's lives, but there are still questions hanging over this whole event. Why was she in such a hurry to get to Paris that she tried to steal a mystical artifact from Doctor Strange? Was her girlfriend in danger? If so, from whom? Or is this all an elaborate Black Cat scheme to get to Paris easily for some caper of her own? I could see her coming back into the narrative just as easily as she left it to answer some of these questions. I mentioned Doctor Strange in relation to Black Cat, but here's the big question I've had with the Spider-Man universe so far. Where are the other heroes in this universe? We've had all kinds of hints and references to other heroes in the world, but no real interaction with any of them except for a note from Wong and Doctor Strange that magically appeared in Miles' hand at the end of the Make Your Own Choices story mission. We have the Avengers Tower, Wakandan Embassy, Sanctum Sanctorum, Matt Murdock's Law Office, Alias Investigations, a statue of Lockjaw, and Fisk Tower being turned into the Baxter Building in Spider-Man 2, but we've never had any interactions with heroes outside of the Spider-Man characters that they developed themselves, like Wraith and Venom. I know that the upcoming Wolverine game takes place in the same universe as Spider-Man, but I think it could be pretty interesting to see a little more crossover with other heroes making an appearance. There is a rumor of Daredevil coming in some capacity, so that could be a start to seeing a bit more crossover action between other heroes and Spider-Man. Moving back to villains though, the question of Kraven's powers is one that I'm interested in. We're given a little bit of background to Kraven's powers in the game if you explore his room, but not a whole lot. In the comics, Kraven's superhuman powers come from drinking potions created by Calypso. This makes Calypso a potential foe we could see in the future. Personally, I'm thinking this one is fairly unlikely, but it's always a possibility to have her coming and looking for the one who was able to kill Kraven. I know Spider-Man isn't the one who actually killed him, but Venom has also been rumored to get its own spin-off game, so I could see that kind of being somebody who comes after Venom. This is another idea that is pretty unlikely, but I also see it as kind of a possibility, and that is new versions of the dead villains from Spider-Man 2. Many of the villains were killed in that entry, like the Vulture, Electro, Shocker, and Scorpion, and most of these villains have had successors or alternate versions of the characters in the comics. For the most part, these villains are also heavily tech-oriented, so I could see new villains picking up the mantle of some of these villains moving forward, either modifying some of their old tech, or people creating their own versions of these villains. As I said, this is probably unlikely, but I could see it as being a possibility. It would be a great way to open up for a more diverse cast and also keep some of the classic Spider-Man villains around in some capacity. Granted, going for different villains will work too, but I thought that this was an interesting idea. Another villain that we kind of get introduced to in Spider-Man 2 is the Chameleon. Kraven is searching for his half-brother, the Chameleon, and you wind up finding his hideout at the end of a set of side missions. This raises a big question though. Is Chameleon going to return? And if he does, how is he going to be implemented? As a master of disguise and espionage, he would be a very different feel of villain compared to those we've faced so far. Seems likely we'll be dealing with him in the future in some way, since he got that pretty significant reveal and a whole side quest chain dedicated to him. But we'll have to see how that will happen. The question of the Spider-Verse comes up in Spider-Man 2. There are the Spider-Bot collectibles that, if you get all of them, you'll have a short scene that is a meeting with Delilah and a connection to the Spider-Verse movies. Does this mean that we'll see more connections to the Spider-Verse at large in the future? While I do see this as a fun direction that the game could go, I also think that it could be a bit hard to pull off for anything more than a little cameo here and there, unless they went like a full-on Spider-Verse kind of game. I'd love to be proved wrong about this. If they could manage to incorporate that into the game a little bit more, that'd be kind of cool, but unless they went with a full-on into the Spider-Verse kind of game, I don't really see this being incorporated much as anything more than just little Easter eggs that could be cool to see. In the events of Spider-Man 2, there's another thing that happens that leaves me with a bunch of questions, and that's Mr. Negative's future in the series. Mr. Negative plays a big part in helping our heroes fight against Venom and the symbiotes. It is his power that gives Peter the anti-Venom power. This seems to drain Mr. Negative of his power in the process, but it's not fully clear if this depowering is permanent or not. Either way, it could be interesting to see Martin Lee's future as a man seeking redemption for his actions in the first game, powers or not. Maybe this will just look like him going back to prison and never being seen again, but I could also see it kind of interesting as him kind of retaking over Feast and trying to make good for all the evil that he perpetrated in the first game. Speaking of questions about the future of villain, there is the question of who will be Venom. Harry becomes Venom in Spider-Man 2, but at the end of the game we see Harry comatose and Venom defeated. However, Venom has always been rumored to have a future in the Insomniac universe, in DLC, or even rumored for a spin-off game. So the big question is, who will that be? Will Harry return as Venom? Will Eddie Brock enter the narrative and take the mantle? It's just really not certain at this point. To be honest, I'd kind of like Harry to somehow stay as Venom, but who knows how things will go. I know we haven't seen the last of Venom. The big question is just how he's going to return to the narrative and who's going to be the one behind the symbiote. Speaking of symbiotes, we have the future of Carnage as well to look forward to. In the Flame side quest chain, we end up with Cletus Cassidy stealing a red sample of the symbiote. This is clearly leading us to a showdown with Carnage in the future. How are we going to get this confrontation though? Is it going to be a DLC? Is it going to be a major storyline of the next Spider-Man game? How about the focus of a spin-off? We don't really know. I really hope that it is at least the plot of a spin-off at bare minimum. I don't really feel like a DLC will do justice to a Carnage-centered storyline. Personally, I would love something like a modern take on the Maximum Carnage storyline. It would be a fun way and could also involve a few other things that I've already mentioned on this list, seeing some other heroes, the introduction of like Morbius and some of those that were involved in that event. But again, I don't know where they're going to go with Carnage, but I do hope that it's worthy of the carnage that Carnage would bring to the Spider-Man universe. Speaking of symbiotes that would add a lot of chaos into things, there's also the question of Null that's raised in Spider-Man 2. With all the symbiotes involved in Spider-Man 2, we see the symbol of Null quite a bit throughout the game. Is it possible that we'll have to face off against the god of symbiotes in a future Spider-Man game? I'm a bit skeptical on this one, at least that it's going to happen anytime soon, because there's still a lot of questions around about Venom and Carnage moving forward. I would think that they want to introduce those characters a little bit more and establish them a little bit more before jumping to somebody like Null. But down the line, this could be a pretty awesome villain to have involved if we get more than just one or two more Spider-Man games in this universe. Another villain that there's still questions about is who will be the Green Goblin. The Green Goblin has been hinted at since the first game. You see some of the tech that could easily be used for the Green Goblin when Mary Jane was exploring Norman's penthouse. We also have Norman talking about the G serum at the end of Spider-Man 2, which many are taking as the drug that will turn someone into Green Goblin. The big question is, who is going to take up that mantle? Is Norman going to test the drug on himself and become Green Goblin? Is Harry going to become the Green Goblin? Or would we go a surprise direction and introduce the Hobgoblin first before the Green Goblin? Or are we going to have multiple goblins and just have a big goblin fest? Who knows? But it seems pretty certain that the G serum will be involved in future games and that some version of a goblin is going to be present eventually. Another big villain question is, what is Dr. Octopus planning? At the end of Spider-Man 2, we see Norman visiting Dr. Octopus, and it seems like he's planning something for the future. We're not given a lot to go on, but it certainly seems like Dr. Octopus is going to be back in the narrative in the future. Whether this is a Superior Spider-Man style plot, a simple revenge plot, or something else entirely, it will be interesting to have Doc Ock back in the mix, especially because he knows that Peter is Spider-Man, and how he uses that information could be very interesting to see. And lastly, we move from a villain question to a question about a potential hero. At the very end of Spider-Man 2, we are introduced to Cindy Moon. She's the daughter of a man that Miles' mother has been dating. We aren't really given any more information, as this is mainly just a reference drop. However, Cindy Moon is Silk in the comics, another spider person. Does she already have her spider powers? Is she going to gain them in the future and be the new spider in training, kind of like Miles has been? Since we know absolutely nothing but her name at this point, it's anyone's guess. However, with the possibility of Peter stepping more into the background in future games, we may be seeing her step into a bigger role in this universe. Only time will tell though. So these are the loose ends and references that I've noticed in the Spider-Man series of games. While I'm sure we'll see a number of these developed further in future games, there are others that may never make it into any aspect of the game other than a nice little Easter egg for us to kind of speculate about. Are there any of these loose ends or references that you think I missed? I know that there are probably a few other ones out there that I maybe just didn't know about or forgot about in the process. Feel free to let me know about them in the comments. I'd love to see even more questions about what we could see in the future. Also, let me know which one of these you are looking the most forward to seeing in future games. I enjoy hearing your thoughts and would love to discuss these with you in the comments. That's all for this list though, so I'll see you in the next video.